Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. How do people become effective organizers? Now, these days, when people talk about organizing, sometimes they really mean just what we might have some years ago meant when we said activism. In other words, people use the term sometimes to just mean lefties doing things. But I think it's helpful to understand organizing as more distinct, as different from both advocacy and mobilizing. So for an example of advocacy, that might be somebody making a presentation to city council about why council shouldn't privatize a municipal public service and trying to persuade the councillors based on a rational argument backed up by evidence. Mobilizing, on the other hand, would be something like holding a rally or running a campaign that features events in which people give compelling testimony about how they're being affected by whatever it is that the campaign is about. But organizing is distinct. It's different. It really involves building a base of people who come together as members of an ongoing collective effort to win change. For example, in a union or a membership-based community organization. And of course, people may use mobilizing as a tactic. But the real question then is, how do people become effective organizers fighting for change, especially radical organizers, that is, people who are organizing today with a long-term commitment to far-reaching social change? The kind of learning that's involved in becoming an effective radical organizer goes beyond learning about things like how capitalism works, why the so-called socialist countries like the former USSR and China, what they were really like, why and how we can oppose imperialist aggression without politically supporting the rulers of the states that are being targeted by imperialism, how gender oppression and capitalism and related, all of those kinds of things are important. But again, there's more and different kinds of learning involved in becoming an effective radical organizer. So I'm really happy to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children to talk about this by Alan Sears, who's thought about this a lot and written about them in his book, The Next New Left, A History of the Future. And Alan is someone I've wanted to have on the podcast for a long time. I should also mention that Alan's written other books too, including his more recent book, Eros and Alienation. So, Alan, could you briefly introduce yourself to listeners?
Great. So my name's Alan Sears, and I am a longtime queer and socialist activist who at various times have been active around Palestine solidarity and around queer activism, around AIDS activism a while ago, and different areas of undertaking. A lot of my political life I've spent in a socialist organization, and that has been a really important part of where my politics come from and how I learned. And I've recently retired as a sociology professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. So that is a brief outline.
So let's start with the central question and see where we go from this. And that's the question of, how do people become effective radical organizers?
And I think it's a really important question to think about because it really relates to how people develop a kind of an active problem-solving skill and a method for something that's incredibly dynamic. I think the way you introduced it was really good. You said there are key political questions that we need to develop a compass for, and we need to develop kind of answers around a whole range of different political questions and understand solidarities and so on. But organizing constantly presents us with a variety of practical issues of various sorts that we need to work through. And we can't simply do this by doing the same thing again and again, by deducing from principle exactly how we should organize in a given situation. Organizing is an incredibly dynamic activity where it's not only about the politics of the situation, but also the people involved, what is getting them worked up, what is getting them active, and so on. And so I think that it's a really, really important question to start to think about it. And to me, I think so much of it is about learning methods of analysis, methods of problem solving, but also methods of development of capacities for collectivity. So much of this is about building what it means to organize communally, to work together in various ways. I think that's a lot of it. I don't know if that helps as a kind of an opening.
Yeah, I think that's great and really interesting. Maybe another way we can pick up and build on this, what you've started with, is the question of challenges and what some of the particular or some of the standout challenges are that people navigate in becoming radical organizers.
So I think one of the biggest challenges is that radical organizing requires ongoing learning and the putting yourself in the double position of knowing, because part of the way you organize is certain kinds of certainty, and learning, openness to outcome, learning from what's going on, and so on, is a crucial combination of skills. So you need to be thrown into the movement, you need to be engaged in various kinds of struggle, and you need to be learning from it. And it's developing that capacity for learning, for evaluation, and so on, that I think is one of the hardest things. I think ideally, as movements are really dynamic and so on, there's a fair amount of time for evaluation, for reflecting on what we've done, for trying to figure out what's going to be effective as a next step, based in part from serious and honest and open evaluation of what we've already done. And I think that moment of evaluation is one of the hardest parts of organizing. I think it's one thing to build, and it can be incredibly exhilarating. It can also be hugely disappointing. There's a whole range of different emotions involved in building anything from a meeting to a demonstration to a picket line. But then after whatever is done, and often to get there, we've had different views. Who's going to speak at the meeting? What should the character of this picket line be? Should the demonstration open negotiations with the police before we start about our route, or should we improvise? What's the tone? Those kinds of things. We may have had different disagreements along the way. And then the action happens. And I think one of the weak points at this point in terms of organizing, and one of the hardest things to get into the habit of doing, is how do we learn from actually what we've done and honestly evaluate, because we all end up invested in certain ways. That might be a capitalist word for it, but invested in certain ways in what we've done, in what we've put a lot of work into, in the arguments that we've had in the past and what ones I won or lost or whatever. And so how do we get to that point where we actually find the spaces to actually say, okay, this worked well in this way, this is missing, what's the next step going to look like? How do we learn from what worked and didn't work? And I think that space of reflection is one of the hardest challenges for radical organizing. I think often people, for example, get committed to a particular range of tactical activities that become almost like a principle, a particular kind of action, a particular way of speaking, whatever it is. And they become committed to it in a very hard way. And so either we all work together despite those differences and we have a diversity of tactics, that kind of thing, or we fight it through endlessly with all of us kind of stuck in a position. But that idea of what's actually working in these circumstances, where does innovation come from as people kind of try to figure out where our power lies in these circumstances? How do we work together in new ways? How do we bring new people in? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges of all for us. I think it's sometimes easier for us to stake out a position and stick with it than it is for us to actually engage collectively, whatever our points of view on what's ideal, in actually assessing what's happening around us and figuring out what is going to be the most effective step forward for this movement, negotiating the real world that we're in and the complexity of actually making change So not simply expressing our outrage and so on, but actually making change in this world in different ways.
What you said has brought up in my mind some of the recent experiences around trying to organize in response to the war on Iran within the Canadian state, and both locally in Winnipeg, where I live, where there wasn't frankly very much action around this, but the way that some people who are committed to anti-war activity have a very particular sense of what tactics are appropriate, and but then also in other cities where I think some people who did really recognize the urgency of the situation and wanted to really rise to the challenge, treated it, some of these are veteran organizers, as if it could be in some way a rerun of the 2003 war on Iraq, as if somehow the situation was the same, or that we could use the same tactics. That seemed to be an assumption that was being made, that I think is, and things that might have been very successful, although we can still debate some of the things that were done in 2003 around that war on Iraq. But the idea that you could simply repeat those and have a meaningful recreation of that experience, this time, that struck me as maybe well intentioned, but having missed a certain kind of reflection. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about the situation of people who actually go through very real movement building experiences with success, but then find themselves in different conditions, and then attempt to kind of just use the same methods and the problems that could lead to.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent as a question, because I think one of the difficult things you realize, and one of the things that makes being an organizer such an ongoing and difficult challenge, is that the circumstances are not the same, and that means a lot. Even in terms of thinking, just to take one relatively small example, perhaps, is just thinking of the influence of social media. And I'm just using this as an example, and how that changes people's conceptions of organizing. And in fact, their conceptions of how we communicate with each other. And so if you are organizing now, not paying any attention to the fact that people, now I'm not saying therefore we all should be organizing primarily through social media, but it means that if you want to organize in a way that's not social media centered, you at least have to have an argument about that takes into account why, for a lot of people, it's going to seem obvious that the first thing to do is do an Instagram post or whatever it is. And to start with that, because it's made such a difference in the way that people communicate. And then you think of what happens in a community when, for example, a workplace closes, where movements have had a history, even the impact of COVID and the lockdown and the discontinuity in terms of organizing projects on campuses, just taking an example of that, it means that all these different factors about the way the economy is organized, the way work is organized, the way school is organized, medical situations, all kinds of things like that affect what is going on the ground. And therefore, we need to be constantly figuring out what's going to work in these circumstances. And that creates, I think, a situation where we kind of need a dynamic tension. On the one hand, I think it can be very useful to have people arguing, this is what worked in 2003. And let me tell you how we did it. And let me tell you the scale of it, because the scale of the demonstrations in 2003 is a scale of mobilizing that we've seen very little of since then in a lot of places, certainly a lot of places in the Canadian state. We have that scale of organizing. And so it can be very inspiring to hear about that scale of organizing, to hear what people actually did, and to learn from that. On the other hand, if we simply think, let's do the same thing and it's going to look the same, despite all the changes in terms of people's political experiences, in terms of things that shape people as activists, in terms of the way work operates, people's experiences of collectivity, all those different things, if we try to simply do it the same way, we're going to miss the boat in all kinds of ways, because people's sensibilities are different. What's possible in the immediate situation is different. And so there's this tension, I think, between simply arguing we can deduce what we need to know from the past, and improvising all the time without paying any attention to how things got to be this way. And I think it's part of the reason that it's so important that these things develop through conversation, discussion, debate, and so on, where we're actually learning from each other, is because essentially it is wrong to completely dismiss past experience and not to be nurtured by it. It's also wrong to think that what we do now can simply be modeled exactly on what happened in the past. And so we're always in this tension. We're always trying to interpret the past and learn from it, but also interpret the past and learn from what's going on now. And this is certainly complex. One of the things that changes all the time is the mobilizing issues that are top of mind. Just to take one example, the centrality of trans organizing in politics today, in terms of the far right, in terms of what's demanded of the left, is something that was not the same and in a time in the past. And therefore, our movements need to take account of what the actual issues are, what we need to know to organize, and that'll affect a whole range of different movements. So yeah, I hope that addresses what you were asking there.
Absolutely. And it also just brings up in my mind, we don't have to talk about this much, but I think it's worth mentioning in a union context, what just happened with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers in their fight in 2024, 2025, where as a member of the postal workers said to me recently when I was in conversation, that they thought essentially that they were going to just do it the same way they had done their previous strikes. And somehow this would be what happens. But in fact, the federal government was prepared to let the strike drag on, and really try to wear them down rather than to immediately try to legislate them back and so on. So that's another example in a union context of that problem of thinking that the next fight or the current fight is going to be the same as the last fight. And of course, one has to learn from previous struggles, but our opponents also change their tactics and their approaches. They learn as well from experiences of struggle.
Yes, it's absolutely one of the central things about management that I think we don't pay enough attention to in some ways, management and the state, is that there's a lot of energy spent on the other side, on the side of employers, on the side of the state, trying to weaken organization on our side, and especially organization that reaches certain high points. It becomes a real priority for them to weaken, and that can mean anything from moving work to new locations, changing work rules, changing technologies. They're using a whole range of different tools, and we need to recognize how that shifts the train. And it's devastating to me seeing because as I became politicized, the postal workers were such a model of militancy and how militancy actually matters, and that involved everything from militant wildcat strikes in terms of the development of unionization in the postal workers to a kind of collectivity that was absolutely committed to shutting down work and so on again and again, and an incredible collective power, a high level of mobilization compared to some other unions. In other words, a high participation from members in activities and so on. And so to see that simply the fact that mail doesn't matter as much anymore, so you think, well, if mail isn't getting delivered, it's crucial. They are going to have to respond. And then you realize, actually, the role of mail in society has changed because of different communications technology and so on. And some of that is extremely deliberate management strategies over time and state strategies over time. And you see it happen. So I think it's such a powerful example of the way this kind of change shifts the ground that we're operating on, and we have to adapt. And unfortunately, sometimes we learn that the hard way. If we think that we're simply going to get it right all the time, unfortunately, that's not going to happen. But we have to learn it the hard way and think, okay, so what does that mean in terms of how we struggle now? Unfortunately, what it can lead to at times is a kind of defeatism where you say, there's no way. We've did our best, and it's a best that had a real track record. We did it, and look what happened. And to move beyond defeatism to think, okay, so what can we do in this circumstance is a huge challenge where we're always, on the one hand, learning from what's worked in the past, grinding our, equipping ourselves to make that happen again. And we're always improvising, innovating, figuring out what's going to actually work in the actual terrain we're in. And in a complex atmosphere where sometimes we face devastating defeats that make it hard to think creatively. Unfortunately, defeat doesn't necessarily inspire creative thinking about how to organize the next struggle. And often it just pushes us to kind of try to recover, whatever it is, to passivity, to whatever. And so how can we be spurred on in some ways by the difficulties of defeat is certainly a challenge we face at this moment.
Well, and I'll just add on the issue of defeat. I think another problem is that people can just look to blame others for the loss. And, if only, this person hadn't been in the presidency of the union, or if only, that group had not been giving us direction. And, perhaps that individual or that group really did contribute to the defeat, but maybe even the best possible leadership in a particular situation couldn't have won because of other forces, right? But there is that risk that people, create the so-called circular firing squad, and it can be really damaging infighting. Which doesn't mean, of course, that we should not be self-critical, but there is that risk.
Yeah, I mean, where you essentially take shortcuts, and rather than really stewing in it and beginning to figure it out, you essentially retain your pre-existing positions and figure out who did something wrong. That means that even though we had everything in place, it was this or that. So no, you're absolutely right that kind of mentality can easily insulate us from the kind of very difficult rethinking that can be required as we try to equip ourselves strategically for a world that's very dynamic and that's changing very deliberately to weaken us.
So we've talked about some of the challenges. Let's move on then to talk a little bit about some of the resources that can help people to become effective radical organizers, to take on these challenges. What stands out for you? So
I'm going to start by Katy, Fox-Hodess, and Rafeef Ziadah have written a really powerful paper based on their experiences of organizing worker solidarity around Palestine to try to stop the movement of, literally get workers picketing and stopping the movement of military goods to be used in genocide by the Israelis. And one of the things that it may sound obvious in some ways, but one of the things that they said in a presentation I saw them do a while ago was organizing is 80% listening. If you want to organize workers to take legal risks, to mobilize at a high level, so not just a symbolic picket line, but a physical picket line that's actually stopping goods from moving, where you need a certain mass, you're going to face law enforcement, you're going to face a whole bunch of things, and get people to do something that they haven't done before in new ways. You can't simply talk at them. You need to listen and figure out what their concerns, experiences, perspectives, commitments are. And it's as you listen, you figure out the way to talk about this in this situation. You figure out what people know and what experiences people have had and so on. So I think that one of the key resources for organizing is actually being a skillful listener. And unfortunately, our model of the organizer is often the opposite, is to be an effective and very confident in many ways speaker, inspiring, charismatic. We have this model of the organizer who kind of comes into a room and fills it magically and people want to listen. And there is something to be said for charisma, for that kind of leadership and so on. I'm not saying, but in the end, they will leave the room, whoever that is, and the people in the room need to work together in various kinds of ways. And so much of that is listening to each other and learning from each other and recognizing that there are clues or to what we need to do in the room already that you may not notice unless you actually hear it from people themselves. And I'll give one like long ago example in terms of my own organizing is that when I first kind of came out in and got really politically involved around queer organizing, it was an organization at Carleton University that was called Gay People at Carleton. That was the kind of name that a lot of gay groups had at the time, and they used gay as if it were inclusive. So my political education in the organization, where there were some really superly political people, and I'd been out for a while, but I'd not been politically involved in organizing around queer stuff, was to think that the word gay was inclusive. And it was actually lesbians in the room saying how much not only did the difference of adding the word lesbian make a difference, but also the way that a masculinist sensibility that meant not listening to women, not paying attention to women's issues, women's concerns, assuming that gayness had a particular kind of male cast to it, was built into the politics. So it's not just about a semantic change. It's not just change the word, add an L, everything will be fine. There is a sensibility politically that you have learned that is actually rooted in a particular kind of masculinity that you guys don't think of as masculinity because it's not the same perhaps as the dominant masculinity, but it is a form of masculinity. It is a form of male power, male bonding, and exclusion of women, putting down women, not listening to women's concerns, not hearing women's voices, all those kinds of things. And so it's an example to me where listening and often trying to listen to the people whose experience is farthest from your own. Often you come in with a certain set of experiences that have shaped you in particular ways. We all do. We're all partial. We all only have experienced part of the world. We try to learn to become more open to, and so on, to develop an active politics of solidarity where we're trying to organize around the needs of the most disadvantaged, the most excluded, the most oppressed, and so on. And yet, unless we are actually hearing those voices and listening, so not just deducing what, therefore, the politics of solidarity look like from the politics, but actually listening to each other and listening to people who have a lot to tell you. For me, for example, just thinking about it in terms of age, listening to people who are politically much younger, their worldview is different. They've had a different set of experiences. And so I think that one of the crucial resources is definitely listening. And one of the things that goes with that is also, in my view, physical co-presence. Like, we need to be together in certain kinds of circumstances. Like, we're only going to listen to each other if we actually have circumstances where we actually are in conversation with one another. And I think that's much more difficult to do. This may be my age, but I think it's much more difficult to do that in a mediated way. And whether that's social media or texting or whatever. And I think that idea of conversing with each other, making eye contact, learning from the body language of people in the room. So when I speak and I see someone roll their eyes or whatever that I might not notice on a Zoom call, I'm learning. I did something wrong. No, they may not even call me on it right away, but I can tell from the way that they're looking right now that I've said something wrong. So I think in old-fashioned ways, I think being together in spaces and listening to each other are really, really crucial resources. And then I'll just add one more, which is then I think there's that question of key political orienting compasses. That is another crucial resource. So for me, that came definitely from being involved in socialist organizations. That idea that your compass gets attuned in ways that allow you to see beyond the world that we're actually in right now. And that is not easy, to actually train your eyes to see beyond what's already there and see the potential in what's already there. And so learning to look at the world and see otherwise, see what's possible in it, is an incredible resource. And it takes some work to do because it means trying to understand how things got to be this way, what the potential powers are to change it, and so on. I hope this isn't too abstract, but those are the two things that occur to me to start with in terms of resources.
No, I think that's great. And maybe I just draw to make explicit something that was implicit. And just that brings up the question of learning from history, right? Because the only way to think, I think, to learn how to look at the potential in, or there may be more than one potential in a particular situation, and to recognize there might be a dynamic that if we amplify and build on, we can actually move something in a different direction than it's otherwise going to go. To kind of learn about that is certainly helped by an understanding of history and how struggles and movements have unfolded in the past.
Yes, and I think the problem is so often when we say learning from history, the model that people have, and I understand why, is like history classes, though there's hardly any left in high school, but it's history in the most boring sense of a list of facts of what happened, supposedly, and often a very partial list in, for example, high school history education, a very partial list that's supposed to present a particular notion to us of, for example, what is Canada. And so history is often presented in this tedious way of things that happened long ago that for a lot of people aren't interesting. It's often like memorizing the names of kings and queens or whatever it is. And so I think that often people have a really, really undynamic view of history, not because people are failing themselves, but because we associate that word with really specific practices of tedium. And I think the idea that learning from history, a lot of that, for example, for me, some of the best learning from history politically that I've done is especially, when I joined an organization called the International Socialists in Canada, which I, in retrospect, have certain criticisms of, but I learned a lot from. I went and joined the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain because I went there to go to school, which was a larger multi-generational organization that had huge problems and has continued to have huge problems that we don't necessarily need to talk about now, but I'm not in any way trying to disguise those. But for me, going and joining that organization, and I'm saying multi-generational, there were people in there who'd been in struggles over a long period of time. And I was in Coventry, where there was a really, really vibrant history of auto worker organizing, and that many of the members of our branch were auto workers of different generations. And there was a mine nearby. And so a coal mine. So people had these different experiences of organizing that I learned sometimes in formal meetings, but most often after the meetings when we'd have conversations and they could start telling me stories about what it was like to organize. And out of those stories, these kind of abstract ideas of power from below that I had, like, what does that actually look like in an auto plant where, for example, one comrade who was an active auto worker union organizer and a shop steward until he got fired. They fired all the political shop stewards at a certain point at British Leyland in the 80s. But until he was fired, he said, like, every day the shop stewards would meet. And he said, essentially plan how we were going to stick it to management that day. And on a day-to-day basis, they were figuring out not how to use grievance processes, not how to use collective bargaining language, but how to organize workers in various sections to actually do something around concerns that people had. So if you have a health and safety concern, you don't go to experts and say, we have this. You actually say, well, we're not going to do this job in this way because people are getting injured. We're stopping in this way. And that kind of power from below on the assembly line, to the extent that he said, there were days when if they were really pissed off, they would just, the people who did the car testing at the end, so the car would run off the line, someone would start it and drive it, they would just drive the cars into walls until management. Now, it's, for me, the idea that you could actually get away with driving cars into walls, that's a sign of a level of mobilization where management can't simply fire you. Now, eventually they did. They fired all the political stewards. It was an incredible purge, had to do with Thatcher being in power politically. I won't get into the details, but telling stories like that gives a sense of what that looks like. And then I could ask, well, how did you organize that? And so in many ways, there's a three-dimensionality to the way that you can learn history by actually talking to people who've had different kinds of experiences. And then as your appetite gets whetted, for sure, I'm not saying you can't learn this from well-written books, from lectures, from podcasts, and so on. You begin to understand a whole story, or not a single story, a whole series of stories that we never get told about how things got to be this way. And these incredible stories of mobilization, whether that's student movements fighting for the right for students to have sex in residence rooms in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm trying to use ones that, people know there was some sort of student movement in the 60s and 70s, often if they're somewhat political, but they don't necessarily know that people mobilized around a whole bunch of things that we may not think of. And much of the way some of the good things about university life now, and there's actually came out of mobilizing around a whole range of different things that we have been written out of the stories that we're told. And you learn from those things, and it provides you with resources, with tools, with methods, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that you can find the answer in history. And I think that's one of the problems with some of the approaches to learning from history is people will act, and you mentioned this before around 2003. Will 2003 happen again in terms of the anti-war protests? Will 1917 happen again in terms of revolution? Will 1919 happen again in Winnipeg, the Winnipeg general strike? The next general strike in Winnipeg will not look in many, many ways like 1919. The way work was organized, the way Winnipeg was organized in terms of where people lived, where people worked, like the dynamics of the urban structure, all those things have changed remarkably. And so on the one hand, it is important to understand from these high points the potential of mass organizing and the ways that people can actually change the world, and the way that people have actually changed the world, and things that people won through those struggles, but at the same time to understand, but now we have to learn certain things from those methods and figure out, well, what does that look like now? What does that look like with the way urban life has been reorganized, the way suburban life has been organized, the way all those kinds of things have changed? And so on the one hand, I think it's incredibly important to learn from history, and on the other, to learn from the present, and what's actually happening around us.
Now, what you've been saying, which is great, has touched on this, but I want to kind of pull out an idea, and maybe you can talk about it some more, which is specifically about how the kind of learning that's involved in becoming an effective radical organizer is different from the kind of formal learning that people are trained to do in schools, for example. You talked about that when it comes to the study of history. But more broadly, we could talk about that in terms of theory, just in general, the difference between the learning that helps us become effective radical organizers and the way that learning is designed and practiced and defined in the educational institutions of capitalist society.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important because I think, unfortunately, if you think of how many hours in formative times of our life we spend in classrooms, and for the first large number of years, that's compulsory. And so we are conscripted into classrooms, and it's called learning. But in fact, a lot of what we're doing in that setting is being trained to be future subordinated workers by adjusting to or internalizing the rhythms that will make us good workers. The first thing about that, or one of the first things about that, is simply time discipline. One of the things that schooling teaches us is we have to be at a certain place at a certain time, whereas the organic play of kids tends to be kind of resistant to time discipline. You do it as long as it's fun. If someone tries to get you to stop when you're having a good time doing it, you resist that. If it's not fun, 1 minute doing it is too long. So schooling says you have to show up at a certain time. You have to train your body so that you don't have to go to the bathroom during class time. Or if you do, you have to put up your hand in front of the whole class, and it gets made a thing of. So there's a whole range of schooling which is learning us to essentially adjust our bodies and our minds to rhythms of domination, but imagining that that's not domination, that's us. And that includes the idea that expertise comes from the front of the room, learning comes from listening, and you gradually fill yourself with these facts. You arrive into a classroom with an empty mind to be filled from the front with stuff that you'll occasionally empty out onto a paper and call it an exam or an essay. That whole model is so wrong for revolutionary learning. And yet it's so dominant in our lives that it's how so much is taught. It's driver's education to get to, I will get to revolutionary learning, but driver's education, like when I was later in life when I first learned to drive a car, because I moved to a city where driving was really necessary to get around, unfortunately. And the first thing you start is with these classroom sessions. And you think, well, I mean, luckily there's also an in-car aspect to it, but I learned basically nothing from the classroom side of it. Because imagining yourself driving a car and turning left is very different than driving a car and turning left. And then you think of activist learning and how much you learn by doing and by building together, by conversing with each other. That's incredibly dynamic. And what you need is forms of learning that are attuned to the activities of people who are coming together. So it's not simply from the front of the room. I mean, I'm not saying you never have an expert come and give some guidance. Experts can help in all kinds of ways. But the idea that an expert, whoever it is addressing a room of essentially empty minds that simply need to learn from the expert, as opposed to thinking you're learning with you're dealing with a bunch of experts who have different expertise. You may know some generalities about the way power operates in capitalist societies, the way technology operates in capitalist societies, whatever it is, the history of this union, the history of this struggle. Those things can be really helpful, but they know what the issues are where they work, what the issues are at the school they go to. They know what language will work with the people around them. They know the specific concerns that may come from their location in terms of relations of indigeneity or racialization or gender or sexuality. They are not arriving empty. They are arriving as people who have their own expertises and experiences and grounded sensibilities. And so revolutionary learning means reflection on what we know. It's bringing together these different forms of expertise to create something new out of it that is very dynamic. And I think that the formal learning model, and so quite rightly, I think one of the things that's really affected the role of the formal learning model in the left these days is that as the left has gotten smaller, unfortunately, and for various reasons having to do with student movements, the growth of universities and so on, the role of university-educated people in the left has increased. And the use of university methods and so on has crept into the left. It used to be when there were larger left organizations that had real social weight, that the theorists who were thinking, learning history and so on from the left were not hired at universities, often had very limited formal education in the sense of university education, learned through movements, wrote in movement-related publications, went to meetings, learned from engaging with people and so on. And I think that there's a way that, unfortunately, the smaller left has sometimes picked up on methods that are not ideal ways of talking. And I know this, I'm very aware that I'm saying this, talking about myself as someone who is a university teacher and a leftist, and who combine those two in ways that mean that I may write at times and speak at times in ways that are relatively indecipherable for people that don't make sense. I'll use languages, ways of thinking, and especially use of various kinds of abstract concepts and stuff that just aren't that useful for a lot of people a lot of the time. And so we'll only get what's useful to people through dialogue and learning from them, as well as speaking and learning the language that's appropriate and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And at the same time, you have a higher than ever percentage of people who have some experience of post-secondary education, right? So it's this complex shift that's going on in terms of how people relate to these institutions and the kind of learning about learning that they pick up.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry about that. But I think my hunch about that in terms of writing about education stuff is that as capitalism has gone along, the reliance on self-disciplined workers has increased in various ways. And we could talk about exactly how that works in the shop floor, but especially the emergence after World War II of new layers of white collar workers in businesses and bureaucracies, in social services, in a whole range of different places, who often worked with more autonomy, that you needed workers who could, on the one hand, take initiative and problem solve and so on. On the other hand, could actually anticipate what management wanted from them in some ways and fulfill that on their own. And if you think of it, a lot of university as opposed to high school and college is somewhere in between. There's a lot less class time. There's a lot more homework. There's a lot less direction. You're figuring it out. You're learning the self-discipline to actually show up when, if you don't show up, there's not necessarily a penalty. You actually internalize a discipline in all kinds of different ways. And that is used now, like even if you look at the way lean production has restructured production auto plants, there's much more reliance on workers' self-discipline all over the place these days. And so institutions that are designed to create certain forms of self-discipline that relate to the dominant order are also the ways that we learn what learning actually is. And we don't necessarily recognize how much those things get combined together. And to me, one of the key things about activism, because I really think I learned far more of value in revolutionary socialist organizations and in all kinds of different meetings and in conversations with longtime activists than I ever did from university classrooms or from university-oriented books. And I think that we need to kind of find ways. I also think it's not only about the quantity of what I've learned, but that it's resonated emotionally, like at different registers in my body and in my mind than what you learn for exams, for example, which occupy a very superficial part of your mind, and then you dump it onto the exam paper, and hopefully you never have to worry about that again. There's excitement, there's a sense of connection with others, and that the knowledge becomes a bond. There's respect, there's embodied practices that you're trying out and learning from and so on, as opposed to sitting still, shutting up, and listening. So I think that there's so much that we need to work on in terms of the dynamism. A lot of what I'll stop after this, but one of the things that just occurred to me just thinking about this is how much I've learned simply from walking in demonstrations, because a lot of demonstrations are boring. Sometimes they're not, that's great, but I've been on a lot of boring demonstrations, some of which cover a fair amount of ground. And so what goes on in a boring demonstration? For sure, there's some chants, and that's good. And it's part of what makes it feel like a demonstration rather than a hike. But the other thing that happens is conversations with other people who are there about all kinds of different things. And those conversations, and it's part of the activism, we're actually engaging when changing the world on the demonstration, but we're also learning from each other about what's going on there, about what's going on where we work, where we, in other organizations we're involved in, other struggles we're connected to. And I think that kind of sharing as we march together is really crucial to think about.
I'm just going to mention a book because of what you were saying about people learning discipline. The book Disciplined Minds by Jeff Schmidt is really interesting. It's something I always recommend to, seriously left-wing students who are considering going to graduate school or professional school, because it is precisely an analysis of the kind of the hidden workings of power in particularly graduate and professional education, but it can be used more broadly. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But this brings up another interesting question, which is about how there's some organizers who I think get how useless for organizing a lot of, the things that are taught in universities are. And then, but from that insight, become quite skeptical or even hostile about theory. And on the other hand, you have some people who have learned a lot of radical theory and think and appreciate its value, who don't fully, or really sometimes at all, recognize the importance of more practical organizing knowledge. So how do these two kinds of learning matter to each other? The more kind of abstract learning and that kind of more applied practical learning?
Yeah, no, and I think that it's really important because I think we often assume that theory by its nature is kind of abstract, removed from everyday life. Again, it often has a kind of a formal definition or manifestation that people may be used to in terms of, for example, academic studies of philosophy and kind of nerdy mind games, essentially, that seem to have nothing to do with actual action on the world, and seem to be at once useless and pretentious, which doesn't tend to be inspiring. And so I think theory, in many ways, rightly has a bad name. But to me, the whole question of theory is so integrated with questions of method, and that the two go together with practical problem solving. Because the question to me is, so what tools are you using to solve the problem, for example, of how to organize an anti-war demonstration, or how to organize whatever it is? But you mentioned anti-war demonstrations earlier. And so it's a very practical problem. Why does theory matter? Theory matters because it matters to have an understanding of how things got to be this way, how the world changes, how power operates in this world, what the susceptibilities are to our mobilization, how our mobilization operates, how we come together in new ways. And all those things are absolutely crucial for our effectiveness. We can keep doing the same thing again and again. We can come together in various ways. We can express outrage. We can do those things. But over time, to become really effective, you need to begin to penetrate beyond what you can see in an easy way to ask, actually, how did it get to be this way? How does this operate? And, even just thinking of this may or may not be kind of just a stupid analogy, but if you need to fix a toilet, at some level, there's things that you can't see hidden in the walls, pipes and stuff, that actually matter for this. And how water actually works in your house. I know nothing about that, which is why I don't fix the toilet beyond a certain level of... And there's that kind of practical problem solving means going beyond what you can see immediately to asking questions about what you can't see and learning about what you can't see immediately. And that's true for the way social power operates as well, our side and the other side. And so it really is beginning to map out the way that these things operate and why. And then that gives us method for actually trying various kinds of things. And so to me, rather than thinking that it's one or the other, the two go together so much because our theory is always being subjected to the test of is it working in practice in various ways. And our practice is always being informed by mapping of the way the world is organized. And bringing those things together is absolutely crucial. To me, it's why specifically socialist or anarchist organizing is important, that organizing around sets of politics that give you ways of understanding the world, as long as that's also grounded in all kinds of activism and exchange with others and is not becoming exclusive and is not claiming to be the exclusive pole of knowledge about whatever, that coming together practically to develop a set of politics and to learn how the world works and how things got to be this way is just incredibly powerful. And, just thinking about examples of how work has changed in various ways and learning how and why that's happened and how and why when management makes a decision like moving a plant from here to there or introducing a new technology, right now AI, for example, it's not simply a decision about AI. It's actually about management power. There's a whole range of different things that they are thinking about how as they're making these kinds of decisions. And we need to have a similar rich tool chest as we're analyzing what they're doing and figuring out the most effective response. And to me, theory is kind of the summary of that. Theory, seeking explanations, which is really what theory is about, seeking explanations for why and how things happen as they do. And a lot of that, going back to, you mentioned before, the importance of history, is by understanding how things actually got to be this way. Because that's retrospectively reconstructed by the winners in a lot of ways, who tell us the way we learn a story, for example, of Canadian history that eliminates the ongoing Indigenous resistance, for example. It's not a story that we really hear, is what did that resistance look like? How did cultures get saved and sustained despite the various assaults, the genocidal assaults of the Canadian state? So theory is informed by those things, by how things got to be this way, and begins to draw out those lessons and communicate them so that we can test them again and again and inform it by what's happening around in the world around us.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about it, and especially the question of how, or not only this, but the question of how things got to be this way seems to be, perhaps the most important, one of the most important questions we can ever ask in a situation, right, where people are really. I'm just thinking about people who are becoming involved in the radical left or beginning to kind of put pieces together and really to try to understand the present as the result of historical processes and to recognize that it's not just a bunch of dead facts in the past, but that, there are these forces that have brought us to where we are, which are shaping where things are going, but that there are also forces that maybe if they're latent, but that could in fact change the direction. But again, just coming back to that question, I think it's such a wonderful way of posing it. And this then brings us to something which you've written about in your book, The Next New Left. And I'm wondering if you would like to share some thoughts about what is different from your perspective today about how people either do or don't become effective radical organizers compared to, just to take your own experience, when you became a socialist in the early 1980s, or if you go back further into earlier periods, what is different, because people often don't have an understanding of the specific conditions that are shaping us in the present moment. But I think it is helpful to be able to see how the way that people become radical organizers today is different than it has been in the past at different times.
Yeah, no, and one of the things you realize, Italian radical leftists in the 1960s and 70s developed a language of recomposition and decomposition as a kind of a way to understand working class struggle. In other words, there are ways that workers collectively begin to figure out what's going on and to develop strategies and tactics that work in the context of what's going on now, to begin to get ahead of what management is doing, to begin to develop tools for improvising, for working together, to begin to share those experiences. And that kind of idea of building our power, at certain times, you get a lot of momentum on that side, where people are actually developing collective capacities, ways to come together. The term I use in The Next New Left is the infrastructure of dissent. This idea that we learn how to remember together, how to understand the past together. We actually work on processing the past and how we got to be here. We learn to organize together. We actually develop the capacities for collectivity so that management can no longer come into a room and have a single person volunteer against everybody else's good wishes and so on, that we actually learn a collective response to things, and we learn ways of developing analysis of the world around us together. And those things ebb and flow depending on movements and struggles and so on. So I first came of age politically in the late 60s. I started going to demonstrations and the early 70s. And at that point, there were very large demonstrations. There was a lot of ability, an orientation towards collectivity in various kinds of ways. And I'll just give one example, which is kind of a stupid one in some ways, maybe, but it's one that, and it may be too university centered, but when I was an undergraduate in the early 1970s, students were much more comfortable challenging profs in various ways. So that the prof would present the course outline to us and say, this is what we're reading, and these are the assignments. And people would put up their hand and say, we don't want 2 exams, we want 1. Or we don't want to write 2 whatever it is. We don't want to read this book. And people would fall in certain ways behind the people who were challenging, because it's good to challenge. We build our collective power through those kinds of challenges. There's a kind of audacity, in other words, that comes from a level of collectivity where people have come together in various ways through movements on campus, and that collectivity actually affects even the way a classroom operates. And the same thing happens in workplaces, where the sense of collectivity means that management can't simply dictate in the way they would otherwise. They actually begin to develop different strategies and so on. And so I came of age politically in a period where there were a lot of strikes. I didn't fully appreciate it at the time. I was not yet a Marxist. But I knew, like, just growing up in Toronto, there were a lot of picket lines around. And there were a lot of picket lines elsewhere, and the mail would stop arriving, or these different things would happen. You saw these. I started going to demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, and you saw these massive demonstrations that were very defiant and that were attacked by police and so on. And so there's a kind of inspiration that goes with that, a collective learning and audacity, and the organizations that I got involved in had aspects of that in them. And that began to change by the time I kind of became really active in queer organizing. I was a little late with that compared to some of my comrades, and became really active in Marxist organizing in the 1980s. Already there was some slippage from the 1970s. There was less of that. The left had less social weight. It had less influence on what actually happened. There were a series of defeats. Work was being reorganized in a whole bunch of ways. Politics were taking new forms. There was a really clear counteroffensive that we now often call neoliberalism, that was changing laws, changing practices, management strategies changing on the shop floor, education strategies changing, tuition fees increasing. A whole bunch of different things come together to change the environment and to undermine the capacities for collectivity on our side. And over my political life, which I think is in certain ways humbling and maybe even kind of sad in certain ways, but the infrastructure of dissent has wound down in many ways. Left organizations are weaker now than when I first became involved in them, especially in terms of that effective capacity to turn people out, to make a difference in the world, to process things, to communicate with each other. You know, it used to be that when I would go to demonstrations early on, there would be a lot of different left publications that were being distributed at demonstrations. And there was a lot of kind of counter-analysis available. And it's not to say that there's not valuable counter-analysis available now, including this podcast. Those things are important. But the the availability, the kind of the practices of collectivity have been weakened in various ways by quite deliberate design on the part of management and the state, who have essentially worked to weaken our collectivity, to weaken our sense of community, and all kinds of things operate that way. I'll just give one example that may help. Is just thinking about when you dramatically increase tuition fees, which have dramatically increased in the Canadian state over the last, especially since the 1990s. One of the things it does is it means that students need more employment, especially working class students, need more employment to get by. They have less time on campus. They have less time to participate, less time and energy to participate in various kinds of activities because they need to not only get to work, which is not about time, but also put life energy into particular kinds of employment and into the persona that's there as a worker in whatever situation they're working in and so on. I'm not, it hasn't gone from 0 to 60. It's not like no students were employed. Obviously, there's always been layers of students, but the number of hours that students are employed has increased dramatically as tuition increases. That makes it much harder for collective life to happen on campus because it takes time for collective life to happen, for that kind of collectivity. And the casual collectivity of people gathering and chatting can lead to more formal collectivity of actually organizing and doing things. When various times when university campuses get shut down by mass protest actions, where the goal is actually to shut down the campus for the day, and you're actually building for that, a lot of what you do is you go to the places where people already are amassed, and you begin to dialogue with them in different ways, whether that's in a classroom or in a lounge or wherever they are in numbers. And one of the things that's happened is that people are hanging around less in those numbers. They're conversing less with each other. They know each other less well. All that creates a situation where it's harder for organizers to be learning rigorously, to and teaching each other to take the time required to process things, to reflect on things, to analyze things. And so I think it's a difficult time for organizing, but I also think there's incredibly inspiring struggles. And certainly Palestine solidarity has been among the most crucial. And the mobilizations, the relentlessness of the movement, which has been incredibly powerful. The way it's actually reshaping what's speakable about Palestine in the Canadian state, for example. There are really, really important struggles happening in all kinds of different ways. Struggle for trans lives, struggles for Indigenous sovereignty that are taking a whole bunch of different forms. So I'm certainly not saying people aren't fighting, people aren't being creative, people aren't being audacious, but without the kind of collectivity and social weight that's been there at times in the past, it can be harder to find the spaces of deliberate reflection where we're actually learning from what we're doing and making ourselves more effective for the next time. And I think that's a real challenge we face in the current context. I'm not saying people aren't doing it, people aren't learning, people aren't brilliant, and there isn't a lot, and I'm certainly serious in saying there's a lot that I need to be learning from people who are doing this organizing now. I'm certainly not trying to say, oh, well, the good old days are gone, but we need to be thinking about how do we come together in new ways to learn about how and why the world works. And, just take AI as an example of something that people are talking about a lot these days. And for people who are younger, the whole question of what does the future of work look like for me? People know AI is there as one of the issues, but also how do we organize? How do we learn? Because AI is leading to all kinds of learning shortcuts, where rather than reading a bunch of different things, you get AI summaries, you do all this kind of. So why is it like that? What does that mean in terms of the future of radical organizing? And I'm just using one example of something that is destabilizing a bunch of understandings that people had of what work looks like, what organizing looks like, what research looks like, what learning looks like. And what does that mean for a left in this context. And there's a lot that we can learn about histories of technology, for example. Why do technologies take certain forms in capitalist societies? How is technology oriented around de-skilling workers, increasing management power, all those kinds of things? There's a lot we can learn from that, but we need to be working together to figure out, so what does this mean for our politics? And that's a massive question. And I'm just using it because AI is there as a whole range of different mediated forms of communication and knowledge and so on. And we need the time and space to be coming together to think about those things. We need the shared frames that we're testing out, not that are kind of the hard rock rules about the way you do this or that, but lessons distilled from past struggles and so on that can begin to help us develop a political compass for making our way through this ever-changing world and this complex world. And I think that it's a time where that's a challenge in various ways.
Yeah, I certainly agree that it is. And this brings us again to something which you've touched on, but I think it would be good to take on directly. And that's the value of people from different political generations engaging with each other as we grapple with that question. And when I say different generations, it's not like these stereotyped Gen X and Gen Z and so on, but to think about political generations, people formed by different political experiences at different periods, which don't necessarily map onto these marketing categories of 25 years and so on that people construct generations around. But just the value about multi-generational, intergenerational organizing and in the learning that we need to do to confront the challenges that we face as we want to change the world.
Yeah. No, and I'll just start with the idea of political generations, and then I'll talk about some examples of that intergenerational learning and why I think it's really important and why it needs to be mutual, by the way. But political generations, I'll start with just a campus. And again, this is partly because I spent a lot of my time as a teacher, but also as a political activist on campuses, which has strengths and weaknesses. But one of the things about campuses, because students are there, a standard undergraduate for, let's just say, 4 years. It varies a little by program and stuff. And in fact, often they're there a little longer because of employment and stuff like that. But let's just say 4 years. So in 4 years, a political generation on campus is about 4 years, and people in their first year learn often from people who are more experienced around whatever it is, who are often like fourth year students who may graduate afterwards. And if you look at a lot of the political organizations on campus, what used to happen at least, is that early in the school year, the people who were the more senior political generation, the more senior students often will go out and flyer, be at various places, attract newer people, and early on say, this is what we've been doing. The newer people might challenge them and so on. But a political generation, in other words, even what that means varies with the context. In a workplace where there is fairly stable employment, which is less and less common now, but it used to be that there were many workplaces where people would work for like 30, 40 years. The rhythms of what a political generation is vary with the context in which you're organizing. And so it's really important that you're using that term. It doesn't, as you said, it doesn't correspond with any of the ways that we kind of map generations in terms of these terms like Gen X and so on. But it's instead understanding that the rhythms look different depending on when you arrive in a situation, and where you are in terms of the trajectory of the expected lifespan of an individual within this context and so on, all matters. And so I like the way that you're using that term political generation. I'm just kind of saying it can vary so much. So for me, one of the things that I found is there have been various times in my life, and I'll use the example of when I was an activist in Windsor, Ontario, where I also taught. And Windsor, Ontario was and is a real center of the auto industry in Canada, and has various histories of organizing that include incredibly important auto worker organizing, especially in the 30s and 40s, but then again, a range of really militant strike activities in the 60s and 70s, but then continuing through in various ways to the times that I was in Windsor in the 80s and 90s. But it also had other kinds of organizing. Understanding how is it in a community. I'd become more political in other cities. I moved to Windsor. How did feminist organizing develop in Windsor specifically? What's the history of it there? And how is that different from the history of the way feminist organizing happened in Coventry in Britain or in Toronto? In each place, you actually have specific histories of that. Who did the initial organizing? What were the issues that got people mobilized? For example, I found out because Windsor, because of its proximity to the border and various historical things, had a long existing African Canadian population that had experiences of political organizing, including, for example, in the 40s, associated with the rise of auto worker activism and a new kind of militancy in the community, and that there were actually racist dining sites in Windsor, Ontario, that excluded African Canadians. They were segregated. They attempted to, and there were sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins in Windsor, Ontario in the 1940s. How do I know that? I know that because people who helped organize those sit-ins told me stories about them. And I don't think I would have, I mean, some of those things have been written about. Other things have not. I don't know if I would know those things if I hadn't heard the stories myself. And also the fact that I heard them as stories often made them engaging in a way it might not be as an article about sit-ins in Windsor in 1948 or whatever. That there would be some humor involved. There would be a personal story. How is it that someone who was a white union organizer played out of the auto plants with a broad sense of solidarity, worked with religious leaders from the African Canadian population in ways that they might not have anticipated because their politics were quite atheistic in a lot of ways. How do they work together and why? And what were some of the tensions there? So I think that one of the things that happens is when people listen to each other, I mean, it goes back to the 80% listening. When you listen to each other, you begin to learn these things about what was possible, how people organized at the time, the way that these things are framed now, and how that is partly global and also partly local. And so I think that it's really creating those spaces, some of which are going to be very informal and some of them are going to be very formal, for stories to be shared, experiences to be shared, and for us to begin to generalize from that, to begin to figure out how things change, how our movements get built, and so on. And I know for me, a lot of it, like there were a lot of opportunities to talk to longtime worker activists. And I remember walking along Drouillard Road, which is a street in Toronto, in Windsor, that used to be, it was informally called Ford City. I don't think that was ever a formal name, but there were huge Ford plants on that road. And there was a lot of residential neighborhood of Ford workers, because basically up until union victories in the 40s and 50s, most auto workers couldn't afford cars and they walked to work. And in that area, walking along Drouillard Road, which is, when I was walking along it, fairly unremarkable, but hearing the stories from auto workers about the taverns, which are now strip clubs. When I was walking there, they were strip clubs and not something that I would think of as a particularly remarkable sight. But the idea at lunch, at work, or after work, we were here, and here we would do a lot of talking about what pissed us off that day at work, that the collectivity that came from those bars was some of the energy that drove some of the unionization, but also to recognize these were men's bars, very much the way that Ontario liquor laws worked at the time, but also the way employment in Windsor worked. There's elements of political segregation and so on involved in these things. You only learn that by hearing those stories. And there's a vibrancy to hearing those stories. There's an old, now it's, I can't remember what hall, but it used to be a Ukrainian farmer labor temple in Windsor that was basically both a Ukrainian community organization and a political organization. People could learn Ukrainian language there. They could learn cultural stuff, but also it was a crucial place when auto worker union activists were denied access to other meeting spaces in town. The Ukrainian Farmer Labor Temple became a possible meeting space and an essential meeting space. So you begin to recognize, well, meeting space was an issue for them. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of Gerard Road, the other thing that people talked about is that during the very important 1945 strike in Windsor, it lasted, I think, 99 days. I should know the exact number of days, but it was a long strike. And what we now think of what happened as unions were institutionalized is that often people who were on strike got strike pay. At that point, the union did not have strike pay. This was a struggle to unionize. The union didn't have a lot of resources. And so how did people eat? And there were actually communal kitchens created on Drouillard Road where women from the community came together, and it was given dominant gender divisions of labor. It was largely women who were doing that work. But those strike kitchens were absolutely crucial to, like, it was not just a luxury. It was not just like a concession stand at a baseball game where you may go and grab a hot dog while you're at it. It was actually saying we need to be eating as we're doing this. The children need to be eating. The strikers need to be eating. The community members need to be eating. And so how does that get organized? And what, therefore, was the role, the unspoken or underspoken role of women in a strike that was disproportionately of male workers? And how did these different kinds of organizing work together? That's something that I only learned from the stories that people have told. And so I think we need, but at the same time, on the other way, when it comes to something like trans organizing, when I came out, the understanding of trans issues was extremely limited in terms of what someone like me would learn we called it at the time, gay liberation politics. And I myself put together in various ways what I would think of as gay liberation politics and socialist politics as I became involved in socialist organizing and so on. But gay liberation politics and the other politics that I had at the time had very little to say about the kind of trans issues we're facing now. And in fact, about gender in general, there was a lot of, as I talked about already in terms of what lesbians said, there was a lot of unspoken masculinity in terms of the gender politics of gay liberation, even though there was some claim about inclusiveness. And even though trans activists played a crucial role in the militant mobilization, for example, at Stonewall, that led to gay liberation. But that stuff was the role of trans activists, and especially racialized trans activists, was largely written out of the kind of history that I'd heard. And now, where I'm learning a lot about trans activism is not from the 1960s generation, but it's from young trans activists who are creating a politic and sets of practices that are incredibly transformative, that are mind-blowing to me, and that I need to be listening. It's not. It will never. I will never be able to deduce that from everything that I've learned. It's not that everything I've learned is irrelevant, but I need to continue to be informed by things that are happening, by movements that are taking place, by the day-to-day things that people are learning through living their life, through forming forms of collectivity, through struggling in various ways, and so. It's really creating those situations for exchange over time that makes, on the one hand, history three-dimensional, but also means that we don't get stuck in our political generation. Because I certainly realize that I can easily stand, and I'm afraid that even in this great discussion that there may be some of this, as someone who's saying, oh, well, the great old days, I'm a representative of the great old days. We had it sus then, and now things are harder. Political generations can't meet if it's really about superiority or the expert and the learner. It's much more about the idea that as one of the characters of capitalism as a mode of exploitation is it's very dynamic. The structure of work changes, the structure of community change. All kinds of things are changing all the time around us. Just think again about communication technologies and how that's changing our lives. And that's the character of capitalism. It's a very destabilizing system by design. They are constantly trying to innovate to increase profits and to decrease worker power, working class power in the broadest sense. And the world is changing a lot. we need to be keeping up to date. So that's and people who are kind of growing up in this world that looks different see it differently and understand it differently. Sorry, yeah.
No, I think I couldn't agree more. I think it's so important, just people to understand that, one's own political generation, we're all shaped by that, and the experience of becoming a political person, becoming a radical for the first time, today in 2026 is so different. There's so many different ways. A younger person in Winnipeg recently commented about, she was trying to understand or engage with politics through Instagram. Like, there's a lot of people who do that, or today often people go to YouTube, right? And so they're kind of bombarded by a cacophony of different channels and so on, where they can get sometimes just, the infographic, sometimes you get the long video essay, but trying to do that in the context of the world of school and work and their perception of, the very bleak future that's shaped by the ecological crisis, and people knowing that they're young now, that if they live lives of average length, they're going to experience really, really difficult conditions. Like, this is all shaping people's political perceptions. And these, if people say who become political and weren't involved in the 2019 climate strike, for example, like people who have no sense of politics before the COVID-19 pandemic, like, it's a very different sense of the world. And if you're not in the same spaces with people across political generations, it's just not going to be possible to, really ground ourselves in that understanding. And the value of those kind of cross-generational relationships, political relationships, which are just all too uncommon. Right? They're just not enough organizations which would bring people together across those generations, and find ways to have genuinely comradely, learning across those different experiences. I think it's a really serious question.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that happened with larger left organizations, is that there was some of that happened in that context. And they literally, if you look at the Communist Party in Germany, that arose through revolution in the 1917-18-19 period, and then was largely destroyed by the rise of Nazism, by the rise of Hitler. But in that period where it was a mass organization, they had children's organizations, they had youth organizations, what matters about all of that is to recognize what it is to be political is different in these different contexts, but that each of these generations and even age categories is bringing politics differently to the table, and that there's learning that can be done mutually from each other. And when there were mass organizations, it's a bit easier for there to be that kind of generational meeting. And now when organizations tend to be small and fragmentary, they often have a certain kind of uniformity to them in terms of age structure and certain other kinds of structures, geographic location within the city, educational background. There are various things that are often more conformist, not because people are choosing to exclude, but because that's who they come across, naturally enough. It means that we're not pushed out of our comfort zone in various ways, and we're not hearing each other over a vaster expanse of time and space. And it's those situations where we actually get to learn from each other. And it's where, I really believe that stories are an essential part of that. And I really believe embodied co-presence, which may be a fancy way of saying simply being in the same room. And some combination between formal and informal organizing as well. I think I've learned more in the gatherings after the meeting often than I have in the meetings in terms of politics. And how do we create those spaces, I think, is a real challenge. But I certainly think the coming together of people from different political generations is one important part of that.
Yeah. And my last question to you is whether there are any things that you haven't touched on that you would like to share in terms of any closing thoughts about things that we can be doing today that can help people become more capable radical organizers.
I think we've covered a lot. I think the only thing that I'll say in the end is I hope a little bit of what's come across is a sense of how exhilarating a lot of that is, because the way that I've been talking could sound a little bit negative in terms of saying, like there was a more massive a left that had more social weight, that had more infrastructure of dissent. A lot of that has decomposed. Management strategies and state strategies deliberately have done that in various ways. We're in a rebuilding phase. There is some important rebuilding going on. There's a ways to go. That can make it sound quite daunting. And as you've pointed out quite rightly, thinking about things like ecological crisis, AI, all the different things that are creating a pretty grim image of the future, that let alone the fact that we are facing genocide, like this massive attack on what it is to be human, as well as massacre. It can all be pretty daunting. And I think the other side that's, to me, important, and it's part of why I think stories are important, is that it also can be incredibly exhilarating and joyful and funny and fun to be spending time with each other and learning from each other and engaging with each other in various ways. That you actually train your eyes to see the best of humanity when so much of what we're seeing around us in the world. I mean, like, it's so hard to, showing my age, open a newspaper or whatever media or social media you're hearing news from, and just face, like, you see the world at its worst again and again and again. And part of what's beautiful about the practices of becoming a better organizer is you actually train your eyes to see the potential that's there and the beauty in people, the creativity, the audacity, the courage of people who, in the most humble ways, will begin to take action around whatever it is in their lives that they feel that needs to take place. And, like, from hearing stories, I've heard that being anything from workers actually taking job action because the food in the cafeteria was so shitty, through to organizing unions because of the degree of sexual harassment that women workers were facing from bosses. All these different ways that people have come together in difficult circumstances, found each other, created vibrant forms of solidarity, listened to their own bodies, for example, in terms of workers' health and safety, rather than management experts or at times even union experts, but actually saying, no, we're learning something collectively about our bodies. Something's going on in this workplace that is actually threatening my health, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm not going to be satisfied by an expert, however many degrees they have, saying, no, there's nothing happening here. We know it's happening. There's an unusually high rate. We know that there's too many examples of whatever it is, and lung diseases, whatever it is. So I just think that it's really important to recognize that coming together for sure has grim and hard sides, and it's hard work. And I'm not for a second going to pretend it's not hard work, but there's also a way that not only do we get the joy of learning from each other, laughing together, playing together, as well as learning a lot from each other, but we also get to see in each other and in others who aren't in the room at the time, examples of what humanity can do and the possibility that's there that is incredibly sustaining, even at a time when a lot of what we capture in media images and stuff like that is pretty daunting and discouraging.
Thanks for that, Alan. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.